You are listening to 95.7 FM WELT, Fort Wayne, Radioactive. The opinions and views expressed in this show are those of the hosts and guests only. They do not represent those of FreeThought Fort Wayne, WELT, or any other organization. Welcome to the Hoosier Humanist Hour, where we explore science, religion, culture, ethics, and community from the humanist perspective. Join us as we discuss those topics and more, free from the ideologies of religion and superstition.
Hello, Fort Wayne. Welcome to the Hoosier Humanist Hour once again. My name is Dee. I'm joined with Christopher, Chris, and Caleb, and our technical advisor, Andrew, in the background, who you won't be hearing much from, more than likely. But we are here talking again tonight about fallacies. We had a pretty interesting show last week regarding fallacies. I think we all enjoyed it, so we thought we'd do another show on that. But basically, we want to concentrate on fallacies and current events. So we'll be talking a lot about current events, spotting fallacies, and that sort of stuff. Our wonderful host, Chris, will be taking care of that topic. But all of us here on the show are part of FreeThought Fort Wayne, and we just do this as a volunteer radio show. And if you're interested in secular points of view, and you want other people to talk to, go check us out at freethoughtfw.org. Hello, guys. Welcome to the show once again.
Hey.
So, Chris, you want to take this one over? Lead us down the path?
Yeah, going down the path. That was follow me down the rabbit hole again.
Right.
So, last time we talked about fallacies and kind of what they were and how they're basically just errors in reasoning. Any error in reasoning. And we talked about how that can be an error in your actual facts, which is not a fallacy, it's just a factual error. But when your reasoning is in error, that's what we call a fallacy. And there's so many of them we talked about that we couldn't possibly discuss all of them on this show, but we gave out several resources to go out and look for some more of those and just kind of play with the idea and look into them. And once we start to do that, it gives us some very useful tools for evaluating the information that we get in our modern day and age. So today we're going to talk a little bit about current events, things that are happening, not necessarily right now, but in the now, in the modern day, that oftentimes are hot ticket items that can cause some pretty critical debates. And as a civilized society, I think everybody would agree that it is best to reach a sound, reasonable, logical conclusion. And often we think we're doing that, but sometimes we don't have the ability to recognize where we may be in error. So the more tools we have for that, the better we can fine-tune our thinking. And when we do that, hopefully we can come to agreements more civilly. So today we're going to be talking about a lot of those items, and we're going to be playing some thought games called What's That Fallacy? We'll talk about how many of the different fallacies often go hand in hand. They can go and feed each other, if you will, and how sometimes we can see differences of opinion generated simply because of those fallacies. So we're gonna get started on that right away. First off, my personal favorites tend to kind of come from areas where we make blanket statements, overgeneralized, oversimplified statements, like all of this is bad, or all of this is good. That's quite simply called the hasty generalization, when we blanket state about something and make a claim that can often be much more complex than we're allowing it to be. So I'm just going to open that up to anyone else just to play for a minute. Has anybody ever heard any claims that might fit the hasty generalization in our modern world? For example, I'll give out an example first so we kind of have somewhere to go with it. For example, if I say that all natural remedies natural remedies, because they're natural, are obviously good for you. We often see that in the grocery store. There's an entire section in the medicine aisle where you'll see things that say herbal remedy or natural holistic remedy for colds, boosts your immune system naturally. We'll see those kinds of things, and that falls under the generalized or hasty generalization fallacy because, well, it's just a little bit too simple. We don't really get information on how it's being good for you, how it's working, or what those driving ingredients might be, or how they interact with the body. We could also see the natural, or the natural fallacy in there, saying that because it's natural, it must be good for you, when we all know that hemlock is very natural and not good for you. So are there any other examples of that hasty generalization that people can think of?
Yeah, I'm sorry, man. All I can think of are really petty examples. I mean, it's one thing to recognize these fallacies. I don't know. I'm having a difficult time conjuring one.
It's just most of the ones that are currently used are all related to food. So you hit the nail on the head with that one. Just the fact that anything natural is good and anything GMO is bad. And those are complete fallacies, not founded by any level of science, which is really ridiculous and very, very disappointing. So this whole anti-GMO movement and pro-natural movement is just a bunch of garbage because none of it's founded on any real science.
Well, and I'm glad you brought up the GMO example, because I think the GMO is a good topic that we can play that fallacy game with. Let's turn that around. So the GMO argument, what are the anti-GMO arguments that we pretty readily hear, or at least what are some of them? Other than, obviously, it's bad for you because it's not natural.
Right, it's unnatural. That's the one thing. I mean, it's all... Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, well, it's mutated, so clearly it's going to mutate you.
Okay.
Which is the most retarded thing I've ever heard in my life. Not even joking.
Kind of...
Here's a good hasty generalization. Some immigrants commit crime, therefore all immigrants are criminals.
That's a good one.
So another really good hasty generalization is that because some immigrants commit crimes, all immigrants are bad. So it's a good example of taking one premise that may be true. Sure, okay, so maybe some immigrants commit crimes, ignoring the fact that other natives do too. Taking that one premise and then blanket applying it to everyone that fits that description is a good example of a hasty generalization. But going back to the GMO thing, so we talked about so it's mutated, or it represents mutations, so it will mutate you. That's obviously a generalized statement that, like you said, has no real logic to back it up. And when we have that, we also can give it another name. So we've got the natural fallacy, we've got the generalization fallacy, but you've also got the slippery slope, because it's not clearly explained how, because the one mutation is existing, it will lead to you mutating, which I would really like to see.
When I have this talk with people, it always tends to come back to this whole the chickens and hormones thing, wherein they're giving chickens hormones to allow them to grow to such an extreme size, which is extremely unnatural, mind you. Like, so there you go again, and with the naturalistic fallacy in and of itself. But then they also have allegedly, I've never actually looked into this, to be honest with you, but allegedly there's these studies out there that suggest that little girls are hitting puberty sooner because of this, and they're getting. I've even heard some people say that little girls are getting larger breasts even because of it. also causing health issues, et cetera, et cetera. Like I said, every time I have this conversation, it always comes back to the chickens and the hormones. We can talk about corn and how many lives it saves. How we are able to grow food in places we wouldn't normally be able to grow food. But ultimately, it comes down to this, and it's a moral issue for most people, at least the ones that I've talked to.
Well, that's a really interesting point, too, because we can find another fun, wonderful little fallacy in that called the causal correlation fallacy. In the slippery slope. So you're saying that the arguments that you've had with people, or the discussions, call them conversations, discussions. Hopefully they weren't full-out arguments, but you're saying that those people have argued that because they hear the word hormones being used in relation to chickens, or I'm assuming beef as well, other kinds of meats, I'm assuming because of that, they're assuming a slippery slope somehow leads to early onset puberty and or increased growth of whatever secondary sexual aspects. The causal correlation fallacy in that is a wonderful thing, because it says that because we see something or a correlation of something, we assume that that's the cause. And that's an error in reasoning. We cannot assume that that's the cause until we've done further testing to prove that it is in direct relation to a direct cause of the correlation. Some wonderful examples are all over the internet. You can look up causal correlation fallacies and examples. One graph that I have here has the divorce rate in Maine, and very closely correlated with the per capita consumption of margarine. So obviously, yeah, so the little causal correlation fallacy you could draw from that is that apparently consumption of margarine directly affects the divorce rate in Maine. So all you people out in Maine, watch how much margarine you eat. You'll get divorced.
I remember when I was in high school, my government econ teacher used to beat it into our brains that correlation does not necessarily equal causation. And he proved this to us by showing that during the summer months, you can see a spike in the sale of ice cream, as well as in the number of armed robberies in certain areas. And therefore, there must be some sort of correlation there, which isn't the case at all. There's no correlation between the ice cream and the armed robberies whatsoever.
Right.
But if you were to look at them statistically, they're nearly identical. If you compare the purchase rates of ice cream to the crime rates, somehow they seem to correlate perfectly.
Yeah. Well, I love how that relates to the GMO or the anti-hormone argument of saying, well, that's going to lead to all these other things, or it causes these things, when we really don't have any proof of that. We see that in a lot of other areas as well, specifically in statistics and how statistics are used in our modern day. We have a kind of a predilection towards using statistics now, which is wonderful. I'm so glad we're leaning towards more evidence-based data, more use of math to understand things. But as we've seen that trend, we've also seen a trend in people using statistics to kind of cheat other people or lie to them or scam them by trying to intimate that there are trends or correlations when there really aren't any. There's a great book out there called Scammed by Statistics by Edward Zaccaro, if anybody ever wants to read it, where you can see a lot of the ways that statistics can be used to create fallacious arguments and make them look very, very convincing. But let's get to another one. So GMO, we like that one. That's a natural fallacy, a slippery slope, causal correlations, all kinds of fun things in that.
Oh, I got one for you. How about circumstantial ad hominem? We can keep it with the GMOs here. There are people that I've talked to wherein I've talked about the benefits of having larger beef and larger chickens. And this person had claimed that I was making a circumstantial ad hominem, which is essentially saying that I'm only saying that this is true because I have a vested interest in this. In other words, he's saying that I just want this to be true so I can continue to eat meat the way that I do.
Oh, okay. So saying that you are a biased argument because of your desires.
Yes, exactly. To kind of break down the circumstantial ad hominem, for those who don't know, it's a fallacy in which one attempts to attack a claim by asserting that the person is making the claim simply out of self-interest. In other words, person A makes claim X. Person B asserts that person A is only making that claim because of their interest in that claim. So it's kind of a nuanced one, but it's relevant. It comes up more than you'd think.
Sure.
Especially when you're talking about stuff that actually matters.
Well, yeah. One that I think could fit that bill really well would be the anti-vaccination arguments, especially with anybody who happens to be an expert on those. The big pharma shill claim, saying that if I'm a researcher or I'm a doctor or something like that, and I try to say, hey, vaccinations are proven safe, they're proven okay, they don't cause autism, somebody turns around and says, well, obviously you are a big pharma shill. You have an interest in that, and therefore you shouldn't be trusted. Would that count as a circumstantial ad hominem? Sure.
I mean, you could throw this at pretty much anything, man. I mean, you could throw it at oil, you could throw it at people who support nuclear energy. I mean, it's on and on and on, and vice versa. You could turn it on its head. I mean, this is just one of those fallacies that people tend to use without realizing that they're even using it, and they don't recognize it when it's there sometimes, too. It's just so... It's kind of difficult to spot unless you're looking for it.
Well, interestingly enough, the first question that comes to my mind is, why do we see it so prevalently? Why do we see people doing it so often? Because we do see that one all the time, right? We see them everywhere.
Well, I think that it's used. Let me phrase it this way. I think that when people claim that somebody is using a circumstantial ad hominem, oftentimes they're probably not. I think that this is just such a nuanced one that, how do I break it down here?
Because it is possible that could be a big pharma shill, right? I mean, I could be getting loads of money to say that vaccines are safe.
I'm sorry, I missed that. Can you say it again, please?
So what you're saying is that sometimes people are not actually making that fallacious argument. Sometimes it might be a possibility. I could be a big pharma shill saying vaccines are safe and getting tons of money, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Because they might be doing something that is beneficial to them, but that doesn't also necessarily imply that it's fallacious for them to be doing what they're doing.
Right. Okay. So I could actually be a big pharma shill getting tons of money to say that they're safe, which actually did happen a very long time ago. No, I did not get paid to be a big pharma shill. Man, I wish.
Yeah.
Send me my loads of money. But
yeah, see, the point is it's a fallacy to just assume that it's incorrect because of the fact that they have a vested interest in X. That's really what it amounts to. I mean, you can use it as, you can claim fallacy, but ultimately it comes down to what the facts are as to whether or not what they said was true.
So just to relate this to a real world situation that everybody faces at some point, we could think about going to a car mechanic, right? A car mechanic will tell you straight to your face that you need oil in your car to make it run. Sure, they have a vested interest in it. However, it is also a fact that you need oil in your car to run it. Otherwise, It will die.
Right.
Yeah.
Duh.
So if you walk up there thinking, yeah, exactly. So it's exactly. I'm just going to let that stick right where it's at.
But yeah, so going back to why do we see all of these things, especially that kind of argument? Why do we see people so afraid that somebody might be a shill for X large whatever? To a point where they're just like, you're just a shill, you naughty person getting lots of money to say good things or bad things. Because we do see that a lot. A lot of people are afraid of that now. And I find that interesting because long time ago, back, I think it was in the 60s maybe, or even earlier possibly, when smoking was becoming very, very popular and large corporations were trying to cash in on that. There were paid studies put out. Researchers were paid very heavily to put out, quote unquote, proof that smoking was not hazardous to your health. A man, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he came finally forward and said, no, I'm not going to do that. He was the whistleblower, and we see that term a lot too. But he was a whistleblower who said, no, I won't be paid to say something about that. And he blew the case wide open and said, look, these companies are paying people to say that smoking is not bad for you when it really, really is killing people. And that created a widespread kind of fear. But we still see that kind of influence in some studies, which is what drives that kind of fear a little bit, I think. What do you guys think?
Yeah,
Okay.
no, it's definitely an old problem that's lingered around for a while and is giving credit to these whistleblowers, which unfortunately nowadays whistleblowers have gotten way more power than they should, especially since most of them are just garbage and worthless human beings. But a few of them are actually legit, and that's the problem, is sorting out the legit ones from the garbage ones.
Yeah, definitely. So okay, we're talking about whistleblowers. Whistleblowers use quite a few fallacies themselves to kind of whip some people into frenzies. Sometimes they may be giving good information, but others may be attention seeking and doing things for personal gain. Regardless, what are some of the fallacies that some whistleblowers may be using? Just going to say right out there, I'm not putting my own opinion on it or not, but Edward Snowden obviously threw some things around, caused quite a bit of fear. Are there any fallacies that we can find in that?
I don't know if this is even accurate, but my mind went straight to special pleading, wherein I would bet that Snowden would say that there are things that should be classified, and for good reason. But he went out and put a bunch of stuff which is classified, and a lot of it was classified for very good reason. And he would say that no, this is a special case. No. My classified information that I gave you is special, so I shouldn't be punished. But if you give somebody else this classified information, you should be punished.
I think you're absolutely right. So can you tell me a little bit more, what is special pleading?
Well, special pleading is basically giving your case special exemption from something. That your case doesn't apply while every other case does. To break it down, person A accepts standards S and applies them to others in circumstances C. Person A is in circumstance C, therefore A is exempt from S. That's the simplest you can break it down.
Okay, so can you give me another example of what special pleading might look like? Because that one sounds like it's a little bit difficult to wrap your head around. But I think that with examples, we might be able to see it a little bit easier. Let me see if I can come up with one here.
I can give you a bunch of religious ones.
Yeah,
That's where it comes from for me.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I hear it the most. My God is special. That's why it exists. My faith is special. That's why it's true. On and on and Okay, let's use faith, because faith is the easiest example I can think of for special pleading. If you were to ask somebody why they believe in the Bible, ultimately it's going to come down to faith for most people. Some people might stick to historical stuff, but we'll just use faith. Ultimately, if you ask them, okay, why is your faith reliable as a tool for measuring truth when the Hindu down the street's faith isn't? And he'll simply have to say that, my faith is special. My faith is true. His isn't. This is a case of special pleading.
Okay. So for example, like if I were to sit out on my porch with a giant hammer and a Viking horn, singing songs to Thor, and somebody comes by and is like, that's ridiculous, there's obviously no reason to believe in Thor, and I were to say, well, but you believe in Vishnu, how is Vishnu any less ridiculous than Thor? Well, obviously, then they go on to say something about Vishnu, whatever it might be. Where that would be special pleading?
I don't know, actually. That one seems a little different for some reason. That one seems like yours is silly, therefore it's not real. That's what that sounds like to me, and I'm trying to think of what fallacy that would be. Maybe appeal to ridicule, or I don't know.
Okay, so tell me about that one. What's that one?
Well, it's appeal to ridicule is a fallacy in which ridicule or mockery is substituted for evidence in an argument. So what you just said was, well, Vishnu is silly. This is okay. So yeah, I guess that is exactly what it was. It was an appeal to ridicule. It's essentially saying that because it's silly, it can't be true. You can see this in like when you talk to people who deny a lot of science too, or people who think that the very concept of quantum mechanics is silly and absurd, or at least the implications of it, and therefore it couldn't be true. I'm not saying it is, but on and on. Yeah, you can appeal to ridicule is a good one. Sounds
like we might use that one quite a bit, accidentally, just because we are kind of a society anymore that likes to poke fun at things often, and I think we do that on both sides. Often we'll say, well, that's just, really, I gotta do that. I gotta call somebody in order to get something done. That's just ridiculous. I shouldn't have to call anybody. It should just be automatic, digital. But we poke fun at things a lot, and I think that when we recognize that, okay, sometimes it's fun, but honestly, it is a little bit of a fallacy. That can help us kind of shy away from those when we get in some tense discussions.
Yeah. And honestly, you can kind of go from there to poisoning the well, because that's kind of broaching poisoning the well in a sense. I'll just kind of explain that one off the bat. This is a sort of reasoning which involves trying to discredit what a person is claiming by presenting what would appear to be unfavorable information. So
fake news.
Exactly. There you go. Poisoning the well.
Yeah, that's not okay. All right.
Run with it.
Okay, so you're saying that when I look at something and I don't like what it's saying, rather than actually attack the argument, I can just sit there and scream fake news, and all of a sudden everybody starts to think it's maybe a little less trustworthy.
Yeah, there are still plenty of reasonably reliable news sources. Honestly, you should be using more than one, first of all. But the fact that there's so much garbage out there, and the fact that we now have to sift through useless information just to figure out whether or not something's true in the first place, and if it wasn't true, you just wasted your time because it was false to begin with. So it discourages people from wanting to even investigate it. Hence, and then they start getting trapped in their own little bubble of self, and their cognitive biases take. Sorry, I'm running on my tirade here, but this is kind of the path that I see being carved because of this false media crap.
It's just that assumes that they are aware that what they're reading is crap, and that they care that what they're reading is crap. Unfortunately, my father does not care, which is why he continues to read things like Breitbart and Allen West, both of which have been proven to be incredibly biased and to make up their own facts as they see fit when it comes to a number of situations. So it's very interesting how people don't care.
Well, that's unfortunate. And I think, do you think it has anything to do with the deluge of information that we have anymore? Deluge? I don't know.
Well, yeah, because his excuse is, well, I don't have time to read the entire thing and to cross-reference everything. It's like, but okay, there are these multiple independent sources that all say that what you're reading is garbage. So that should tell you something. But, oh, okay, you don't have time to do that. So you just continue sharing garbage and think that's okay. All right, gotcha.
So
yeah.
So it sounds like knowing how to spot some of these fallacies almost intuitively, or building it to a point of intuition, would kind of help reduce some of that strain of that over information.
It's just
certainly wouldn't hurt.
Having the ability to critically think is just an ability that's apparently rare.
Hopefully it's not so much anymore, or getting better. Speaking of critical thinking and building some of those skills in order to help you spot fallacies and fake news and things like that, and shy away from the fear of just calling everything fake news. And speaking of which, tomorrow there is going to be May 25th. There's going to be a free lecture by Journal Gazette editor Sherry Skufka. I hope I didn't mess her name up. It is an event sponsored by FreeThought Fort Wayne, and it is from 6:30 to 8 p.m. tomorrow at the Fort Wayne Main Library in Meeting Room C. Unfortunately, that is not going to be accessible to most, but it will be featured on the Fort Wayne FreeThought website and on YouTube. So it's going to be all about fake news and how to spot it and how to kind of stay away from that fear of just kind of blasting everything with a blanket, hasty generalization of fake news. So that's really great.
Well, on the topic of logical fallacies in today's society, I kind of think it's important to mention this and how it's important to look for it in the political dimension. Like, for example, and I'm not necessarily saying, Trump, but I'm going to use Trump as my example here because it's pretty obvious. Trump has been known to use what's called the bandwagon fallacy. In other words, there's so many people that agree with me that I obviously must be right. You see that, you especially saw this during his campaign. He'd walk up on stage to be like, wow, look at how many people are here. This place is packed, not an open seat in the house, blah, blah, blah. And he would use that as a point of endearment. And he still uses it. He used it during his inauguration speech thing. He's all butthurt about the inauguration speech numbers and that whole debacle. But over and over and over, you constantly hear him, say something along the lines of, I have so many people that agree with me, therefore I must be right, and more people should agree with me.
Yeah, and I think we use that quite often, and I think it's really important to know a little bit more about that too, because some other people that known as sophists, and I think it's important to understand what a sophist is. So I'll just take a minute to talk about that real quick. A sophist is somebody who uses rhetoric and debate, but uses fallacies in it in order to convince people, rather than sound and valid logic. So sophist,
a con artist,
essentially, yes. But it's, they're not just trying to sell you something. They're trying to convince you with things that sound reasonable, sound logical, but in fact have veiled kind of errors in logic. So people often try to turn on logical arguments that come from large amounts of sources by claiming that they are bandwagons. When I think about this, I think of climate change. How often people try to turn around and say, well, just because, those 99% of scientists that say climate change is real, they don't want you to know the truth. They're all paid shills. That's the bandwagon fallacy is being used against us. Saying, We shouldn't be believing these people, trying to get us to think that there's a bandwagon fallacy there when in fact it's not. It's just corroborated opinion. So let's see, what else we got out in the world right now? Well, there's a lot of things going on with, and I hate to bring Trump back into it again, but there's the whole Russian collusion topic, and I think there's a lot of really good information out there about it. I think that there's a lot of things going back and forth that could be good, but we really have to be looking at where some of the fallacies might be. We've got appeals to authority all over the place. We've got appeals to bandwagon saying, so and so. All these people have said yes, there's something going on, so people might be led to believe that something has to be there. But we don't know if that's the case. Now, we do have quite a few. We have to look at the evidence. The evidence seems to be starting to come out. But it's hard to weed through it all. Which brings me to the loaded question fallacy, which is basically just asking a question that has an assumption built into it so that it can't really be answered without appearing guilty. Now, what was his name? General Flynn? Is that the guy?
I believe so.
Yeah.
I don't know if he was a general, but I'll go with it.
I can't remember who it was. But anyway, this is a really good example of a loaded question. He was asked, then told, to produce documents. And his attorneys said, no, we're going to plead the fifth because of the way that these documents were demanded or requested. And their logical rebuttal to this was, we're pleading the fifth because whether we produce them or not may serve to cause other people to incriminate him. So what they're saying is, if we produce them, people are going to think that there's got to be something there. If we don't produce them, people are going to think we're hiding something. So we're kind of stuck. We're in a catch-22. We are stuck by this request, ergo, we're pleading the fifth. Technically, I feel that's a very logical rebuttal. But some people have used that as a loaded question to say, hey, look, smoking gun, he's not cooperating, and therefore he must be guilty. Maybe he is guilty. That's quite possible. But I have to applaud the people who are in charge of kind of prosecuting him, because many senators have said, hey, look, we're going to have to find another way to subpoena the information or find the information that we need. And I applaud them because they recognize that, yes, that is a loaded way to do it. It's not fair. It's not what our country is all about. So what do you think about that whole situation? Do you think that's a loaded question? Do you think they handled it correctly or not?
I don't know. I mean, because the two options don't seem neutral to me. Giving the information as opposed to not giving the information, to me, aren't the same thing in the same sense. To simply say that they are the same because people would say whatever, to me doesn't mean that they are the same thing. I think that they should give that information if it was requested during the special investigation.
No, so I agree. I agree with you. I think that if that information were given and there were nothing to be afraid of, then he really shouldn't have anything to be afraid of. He should just produce it. But if there's something to incriminate him in the information, then obviously that information needs to be shared either way. So I think, yeah, logically, he needs to produce those documents. But I'm glad that people recognized the fallacy of how it was requested. And that's, I think, where their lawyers were. But, there's a sophism there where the lawyers are evading the issue by offering up this recognition of a fallacy. They're evading the issue of whether or not the information would incriminate him by saying, oh, well, it's not fair to put him in that position. So while they're offering a real fallacy, they're saying, yes, it is actually a loaded question. I agree with you. I think that they're using it as a shield, using logic as a shield, and that I would call that a sophist's argument.
And I see the same line of reasoning being used to defend Trump not releasing his tax returns and Hillary not releasing her emails, even though those ended up being released anyway and still exonerated her anyway. But I don't know. I see the same line of reasoning being used in a couple of other political situations.
Which line of reasoning? The loaded question or the sophist deal?
The line of reasoning that, oh, well, if we release them, then we're screwed. If we don't release them, then we're screwed. That same line of reasoning.
Yeah. Well, and so it's interesting to see that ends up kind of, I think, being, especially in politics, that ends up being a quick first line of defense, is to claim that we're in a catch-22 here. And if we hear that kind of argument, we might start thinking, hey, maybe a fallacy. Maybe you're not in a catch-22, even though you're trying to point it to that direction. Catch-22, by the way, if anybody's interested, is another fallacy that's called circular reasoning, saying that we're locked into something, or I'm sorry, not circular reasoning, rock in a hard place. What is it? Oh, two options when there really are more than two options.
False dichotomy.
Thank you. False dichotomy, saying that, if damned if we do and damned if we don't, for example, or I don't know if I can say that or not.
Yeah.
Can I do that? Okay. So yeah, saying that, we're kind of claiming that we are stuck in two positions when maybe there is a way to go to a third position, or there may be another option. That's a false dichotomy. So when they use that, claiming the loaded question, when there may not be a loaded question, that's another example of that false dichotomy as well.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. My mind was false dichotomy. I was going to interrupt you there in a moment until you get distracted with the rock and hard place. But yeah, no, I'm right there with you, brother. I don't know why, but I kind of want to talk about misleading vividness, because this is one that applies to a lot of political situations and, honestly, even philosophical ones as well. Misleading vividness is a fallacy in which a very small number of particular, very extreme events are taken to outweigh a significant amount of statistically normal events or evidence. So, for example, some people might claim that the sheer extremity of the terrorist attack at 9/11 should be significant enough to disallow Muslims from coming into this country. This sort of line of reasoning.
And that it's descriptive enough right there, I think. If you think about misleading vividness, it really says, I'm shining a spotlight on a candle so that you think that the candle's brighter. We use that in many, many different cases when we need some weight to our argument, but we really know that we don't have any, or maybe we just don't know it and we just do it as a knee-jerk reaction. Like you said, using any kind of argument where we take one or a small handful of incidents and claiming that it needs to warrant this massive overhaul or massive legislation to take care of it, could be an example of that. What about gun control? I'm going to throw that out there. Ooh, scary topic.
Yeah,
People don't like to talk about it. But I think you'll see some misleading vividness on both sides on that one. We hear a lot of people say, well, look at this example of a shooting. We can't have that anymore. And while yes, tragic, absolutely, it's a bit of an overgeneralization, and it's using that misleading vividness to give the weight or give the doorway to that generalization, when we know that topic is probably more complex. Works the other way around too, though. If we're sitting there saying that, all the guns in my neighborhood are safe, it's not gun control that's necessary, it's whatever else. Guns are okay. We can't use that spotlight, that misleading vividness to drive those arguments. Which is not to say that good information can't be had on both sides. The good arguments, it kind of reminds me of Bill Nye, when he used to be very anti-GMO, based on some very valid arguments. He had some strong arguments because he's a very rational person. But then all of a sudden he said, you know what? Look, I've listened to some other arguments. I've listened and done some research, and I've changed my mind. He tried to avoid all the fallacies, and eventually he led himself to a different decision, which I applaud. But that vividness, that misleading vividness, is a big one for me, especially in the gun control debate. We all want to be better thinkers, I think. I think we all consider ourselves intelligent people. I really think that everybody does. Maybe I'm wrong on that. I don't know. But I think generally people consider themselves intelligent, and generally people want to be able to critically think. And so the first steps in that, I think, are to be able to start recognizing errors in logic, and then that gives people that opportunity to start thinking through them. Because I think we ultimately really want to be not just recognizers of fallacy, but we want to be people who can that can work them through and find them and find that logical problem intuitively. And by starting on that path of just recognizing them and using them as kind of a game or a flag post or a signpost when we're looking at the world around us and the events that are going on, that's a great way to start developing that thought process. Because I think, Christopher, you nailed it. It was definitely a chicken and the egg situation. So that's encouraging to me, is that we are looking at these fallacies, talking about them, finding ways to recognize them, but then using that in order to really kind of just encourage ourselves to think through them, so that we can not have to use only the ones we know, but recognize where there may be one, and then kind of trying to find what that flaw really might be.
Yeah. But honestly, to kind of poke at devil's advocate just a touch. I do have to admit, and I personally think that there is a certain bliss in ignorance, and I think that it's kind of I think it applies mostly across the board. I was trying to imagine, trying to feel like I felt when I was a kid, when I was really, really young, like in first or second grade, and I just, I realized that I can't, because what made those moments special was the fact that I was ignorant to certain things. Like, for example, my earliest memory is of me sitting on the porch. I was very young. I was probably like 3 or 4 is my very first memory. And I was sitting on my mom's lap, and it was the sunset, and I heard the cicadas in the background, but I had no idea what the cicadas were. And I'm sitting here on the porch and just thinking, wow, this is so pretty. And even the sound of the cicadas, it sounded beautiful to me, just gorgeous, beautiful, and just it was just a surreal scene. And I asked my mom, I said, what is that sound? Now, mind you, I had been listening to this for probably weeks at this point, but this is the first time I'd ever thought to think to ask, what is making that sound? And she told me, well, they're little bugs in the trees. And I said, wow, that's really, wow. And that moment, that moment of discovery, because I was ignorant at one point, and then I just discovered something amazing. And, the bugs, they sound beautiful, but eventually it kind of tapered off. I got jaded to it. So it's that I can't really get myself to do that. I don't know. That's just me. I think it's a personal thing, but I do think that my other statement stands, wherein, I think there's a certain bliss in ignorance, hence the motto, ignorance is bliss.
That's an interesting thought. Oh, go ahead.
No, I don't look at it as that. I think there's a certain excitement in discovery. I would rather look at it as that. Because I don't think there's anything happy about being ignorant. What's happy is finding out what causes whatever you're looking at. I think that's what really is truly satisfying.
I like that. I never really thought about that. That's actually wonderful to think about. I like that. Because it's absolutely true. Because all the things that I thought about were about discovery.
Mm-hmm.
All the things that just blew me away. Like the first time I realized that sound, it took a second to get from A to B. I always thought it was instantaneous. I was in 3rd grade. My teacher walked 100 yards down a football field, clapped 2 2x4s, and then 2 seconds later I heard the clack. And that was the first time in my life I'd realized that sound wasn't this instantaneous thing. And I was like, whoa, that blew me away. That was amazing to me.
Now, it's really interesting. I love that you brought that up. Because there's a fallacy called willful ignorance or willed ignorance, which asserts that I believe X, you have evidence that's contrary to X, and I don't want to see it because I don't want to stop believing in X. It would make me unhappy, and therefore it's better to be happy than to believe in the contrary evidence. So that is a logical fallacy, assuming that it might be happier to do that, because there could be happiness that results from the contrary evidence. It just might take a minute, and it might take a little bit of recognition, but it is not entirely logical to believe that just because something makes you happy, or not knowing something makes you happy, that is true happiness. But interestingly enough, scholars that have discussed this fallacy, this willed ignorance fallacy, have said, there are circumstances where ignorance may truly be bliss in some cases. For example, if one thought experiment goes, there was an old man who was dying in a hospital, and a military man came in, and the military man, or the dying man, was not able to see very well, and the military man came in and sat down with the dying man, and the dying man held his hand and passed away in the night. And when the military man walked out of the room, the nurse said, "I'm sorry for your loss." And the military man said, "Well, thank you, but who was that man?" Because the nurse obviously assumed that it was his son, and she said, "Well, that was so-and-so. You're his son, correct?" He said, "No, I'm Sergeant whomever, and I was here to tell so-and-so that his son has died in combat. Was that so-and-so?" And so the thought experiment there is that, did the man die truly happy? He thought his son had come home. Well, that may have been an example of, where his ignorance was blissful to him. Did the man do the right thing is another fun thought experiment. Did the military man do the right thing, not telling him who he was? But those are questions of moral significance, like you said.
Yeah, this is why I'm a moral nihilist, man. That morality is a human contrivance, and that this kind of proves it. It can't be a real thing. It can't. That's paradoxical if it was.
I would say that it's relative. I would say at that point, I'm a moral relativist at some points. In that case, in that thought experiment, I can't say for all of them, but in that case, I might say that it depends on whose perspective you're taking. That would be a relative thing. But like we said, the in relation to the fallacy, that might be an example where maybe his ignorance was considered blissful. But the point is that because we're aware of the fallacies, we can avoid making them when we have that discussion. And we can have a fantastic, highly intellectual and enlightening and enjoyable conversation about the merits and flaws, the pros and cons, wherever that goes. And it would be a civil discussion. I think we would both come away with a lot of really interesting ideas because we are able to kind of sidestep some of those fallacies and avoid them. We might make them, because I can't say that I know them all, can't say that I can avoid them all. But hopefully people would call me out on them.
I was just called out on what? I mean, I was just doing that a little bit ago. You know, what did you go, like, appeal to ignorance? Is that what it was? Or blissful ignorance?
Willed ignorance. Or
willed ignorance. Yeah, and I'm happy to have been proven wrong. I am wonderfully happy to have been proven wrong on that one. I really thought that it was because I was ignorant that's what made it special.
Well, and it might be neat too that you know, like we said, that we can even say that you might not always be wrong. You know, it doesn't have to be so black or white.
Yeah.
Cases.
Absolutely, brother.
All right. Okay, so you know, I find that a fantastic place for us to be. I think we've done a lot of talk about where those fallacies are, what they can be, how to recognize them, and what really the goal is to use them to kind of sharpen our critical thinking skills and enable us to not just start calling them out, but recognizing where something feels fallacious and having a way to entertain and look for some of those things to help us identify why it might be fallacious. And I'm just really, really happy that we culminated in that kind of example, this kind of good show of how that really can be applied. I don't know, guys. I'm thinking...
What? Well, hey, man, I want to thank you for that example that you gave, that question that you posed about whether or not good for the old man to have known his son died. I've never heard that before in my life, and that got me thinking, and I'm going to use that in the future, man. That's pretty good. Thanks for that.
Hey, no problem. Facebook.
Oh.
Sorry.
Good enough for me.
No, I used it in class, actually, in several classes, just kind of helping people see that maybe things are a little deeper than we always take them to be. So, yeah. So anyway, that kind of wraps up our conversation about fallacies. And I have to say it's been a really enjoyable and intellectual road to haul. But I really appreciate you guys talking about it with us.
All right, guys. Well, we got to wrap it up. Thanks for listening, everybody. This has been the Hoosier Humanist Hour, and we'll catch you next time.
Good night.
See ya.
That is all the time we have for you this week. This has been the Hoosier Humanist Hour. Be sure to check out FreeThought Fort Wayne on Facebook and on meetup.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope your days are filled with logic, reasoning, and the eternal quest for knowledge.